Tonight we explore the life and mind of Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch painter whose art, madness, and passion turned him into one of history's most misunderstood geniuses. From starry nights to tragic endings, Van Gogh's story is one of brilliance clashing with pain and beauty born out of suffering. His legacy still stirs hearts, inspires artists, and challenges our ideas of success and failure. Before you get comfortable, as always, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories keep you up, other times they put you to sleep. We're working on a few boring ones, don't worry. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soothing hum, and let's dive into the world of Vincent van Gogh together. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853, in the small village of Zundert, in the southern Netherlands. His birth was quiet, but its timing was haunting. Exactly 1 year before, his parents had given birth to another son, also named Vincent, who was stillborn. They buried that child and gave their next son the same name. Vincent grew up knowing that just outside the local church, a tombstone bore his name and birth date, only a year off. Imagine what that does to a child's mind. He was the eldest of 6 children born to Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, a woman with a passion for nature and drawing. His family was religious, structured, and modest. From early on, Vincent was different, sensitive, serious, withdrawn. He often wandered alone in the countryside, staring at fields, trees, and skies. Nature, even then, spoke to him in a way people often didn't. School never quite worked for him. Though intelligent and curious, he struggled to connect with classmates and teachers. He wasn't an easy child, prone to sudden mood swings and long silences. Some described him as intense, even difficult. Others saw him as kind, thoughtful, and deeply feeling. But above all, he seemed to live just slightly apart from the world around him, like a guest in his own life. His younger brother Theo would become his closest companion, emotionally and spiritually. Their bond would one day carry Vincent through the darkest moments of his life. But in these early years, Vincent was mostly alone, with his thoughts, his questions, and the landscapes of his imagination. He wasn't painting yet. That would come much later. But the seeds were already there. A fascination with nature, an obsession with beauty in the ordinary, and a loneliness that colored everything. Vincent wasn't the type to demand attention. He lingered on the edges of things, quiet, watchful, collecting details the rest of the world ignored. Even then, it was clear this was no ordinary child, and perhaps deep down, Vincent knew he was walking a path few could understand. A life of color, heartache, and beauty was waiting just ahead. But for now, he was simply a child of silence. As Vincent entered his late teens and early 20s, the world expected him to find direction, a career, a purpose. But Vincent's path refused to straighten. Instead, it twisted, stalled, and doubled back. He tried to fit into the mold society offered, but something inside him always resisted. His uncle, a successful art dealer, helped him land a job at the firm Goupil & Cie. Vincent moved to The Hague, then London, and later Paris, surrounded by galleries, collectors, and the business of art. But for Vincent, this wasn't the world of beauty and emotion he longed for. It was commerce, cold, mechanical. His passion faded. He grew moody, withdrawn, and was eventually let go. In London, he fell in love with a woman who rejected him, and the pain was sharp. This heartbreak, along with his increasing discomfort in the art world, began a new phase in his life, one marked by spiritual yearning. He turned to religion, hoping to serve something greater than himself. He trained briefly to become a minister, but failed his theology exams. Then he took up missionary work in a poor mining region of Belgium known as the Borinage. There, among the soot-covered workers and starving families, Vincent tried to live like Christ, giving away his possessions, sleeping on floors, embracing poverty. The church saw this as fanaticism and dismissed him. It was another failure, another closed door. But in this darkness, something unexpected stirred. He began sketching the miners, the laborers, the people around him, not with polish or technique, but with empathy, with feeling. His pencil became a way to understand suffering, to reflect it, and perhaps to soothe it. At 27, after years of restlessness, rejection, and confusion, Vincent made a quiet decision. He would become an artist. Not because it promised success or praise, he had no illusions of that, but because it felt like the only honest way to express what was inside him. His journey to art was not one of ambition, it was survival, a way to process the world and his place in it, to turn inner chaos into something others might recognize as beautiful. Vincent van Gogh hadn't yet painted a masterpiece, but he had found something even rarer, direction, and with it, the first true glimmers of purpose. Vincent's decision to become an artist didn't arrive with a bolt of lightning. There was no applause, no sudden sense of mastery. What came instead was effort. Hard, uncomfortable, relentless effort. He had no formal training, no academic pedigree, and no real support beyond his brother Theo, who quietly began sending him money for supplies and living expenses. But Vincent threw himself into the work. He studied anatomy, perspective, and technique with obsessive intensity. He copied sketches from old masters and filled notebooks with his own. Art became his full-time labor, mentally, physically, and spiritually. It wasn't a hobby. It was a necessity. His earliest works were dark and heavy. Deep browns, greys, and blacks dominated the canvas. They were not meant to charm. They were meant to tell the truth. Vincent painted peasants in the fields, old women in shawls, worn-out laborers hunched by firelight. He was drawn to the ordinary, to the worn and weathered faces of real life. One of his first significant pieces, The Potato Eaters, was a reflection of that vision. A family sits around a simple table, lit by a single dim lamp. Their hands are rough, their expression somber. You can almost hear the silence between them, feel the exhaustion in the room. Vincent believed it was honest, but the art world dismissed it. Too crude, too grim, too raw. He was crushed, but not defeated. Vincent wasn't trying to please anyone. He was trying to see. He once wrote, "I want to touch people with my art. I want them to say, he feels deeply, he feels tenderly." And he meant it. He wasn't just painting images, he was painting emotions, his own and those of the forgotten people around him. Throughout these early years, he bounced between towns and studios, living mostly in poverty. He rarely ate well. His clothes were often tattered. His health declined. But the more fragile his body became, the stronger his artistic voice grew. He was learning to speak with color, with texture, with silence. Though still unknown to the world, Vincent van Gogh had become something real, an artist not of technique, but of truth. His style was forming, his soul was pouring out, and though recognition was nowhere in sight, a storm of creativity had just begun to gather inside him. In 1886, Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris, a city that pulsed with energy, art, and change. His brother Theo, now an art dealer, welcomed him into his small apartment in Montmartre. It was cramped and chaotic, but for Vincent, it was a turning point. The Paris art scene was electric, and it would forever change the way he saw the world. Here, he encountered Impressionism and its softer cousin, Pointillism. Gone were the muddy browns and dark shadows of his earlier works. In their place, bright colors, loose brush strokes, and sunlight captured on canvas. For the first time, Vincent's palette exploded. He traded earth tones for yellows, reds, and electric blues. The grey skies of the Netherlands gave way to skies filled with movement and mood. He also met fellow artists, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Émile Bernard, and Camille Pissarro. Among them was Paul Gauguin, a bold and confident painter whose relationship with Vincent would one day shape and shatter his life. Still, even in the lively cafes and bohemian streets of Paris, Vincent remained an outsider. Socially awkward and emotionally intense, he struggled to connect. He longed not for parties or praise, but for something deeper, understanding. He didn't just want to paint like the others. He wanted to feel differently, to see the world through emotion, not technique. His work became more experimental. He began painting self-portraits, dozens of them, each one capturing a shifting state of mind. In some, he stared directly at the viewer, challenging them. In others, he looked away, as if lost in thought. These portraits weren't about vanity. They were a mirror of his inner turmoil. Though his art was evolving, so was his isolation. The noise of the city, the relentless pace, and the emotional weight he carried became too much. He grew tired, agitated. He needed peace, space, light. And so, in early 1888, Vincent left Paris behind and headed south to Arles, a quiet town in Provence. He imagined it as a kind of sanctuary, a new beginning, a place where he could paint the sun, the wheat fields, and the warmth he so desperately craved. He didn't know it yet, but Arles would become the stage for his most iconic works, and his most painful unraveling. When Vincent arrived in Arles in February 1888, the cold mistral wind was sweeping through the town. But Vincent didn't mind. He had come chasing sunlight, and soon the landscape would bloom with color. Yellow wheat fields, violet mountains, blue skies, everything he had imagined. He rented a small house with lemon-colored walls, the now famous Yellow House, and declared it the beginning of his dream, an artist's haven in the south of France. His plan was simple yet grand. He wanted to build a studio of the South, a shared space where like-minded painters could live, work, and inspire each other, a creative brotherhood. Vincent believed deeply in community, even though he often struggled within it. The solitude of his past made him crave connection, and in Arles he hoped to finally find it. He painted with manic energy, sunflowers in a vase, fields under heavy skies, blossoming orchards, starry nights. His brushwork became more confident, more alive. He no longer painted what he saw, he painted what he felt. The warmth of the sun became a fierce yellow on the canvas. The stillness of a room became a swirl of emotion in color and line. Despite moments of joy, the loneliness lingered. He wrote letters to Theo constantly, describing his work, his meals, his mood swings. Vincent was always trying to explain himself, as if hoping someone, anyone, would truly understand what was going on inside him. In the autumn of 1888, Paul Gauguin finally arrived in Arles. Vincent was ecstatic. At last, his vision of an artist commune seemed possible. He filled the Yellow House with paintings, decorated Gauguin's room, and prepared for days of creative collaboration. But the dream quickly cracked. Gauguin was independent, proud, and often dismissive. Vincent was emotional, anxious, and deeply sensitive. Their personalities clashed. Conversations turned into arguments. Vincent grew more unstable, afraid Gauguin would abandon him. And yet, despite the tension, he created some of his most memorable work during this time, including the iconic sunflowers, which he painted to welcome Gauguin. Vincent was holding on to something fragile, a dream built from loneliness and color. But underneath the surface, something darker was brewing. The pressure, the fear, the desire to belong. In Arles, Vincent reached new heights of brilliance, but the higher he climbed, the more unsteady he became. By the end of 1888, the atmosphere inside the Yellow House had become unbearable. What began as a hopeful collaboration between two artists had descended into daily conflict. Gauguin found Vincent unpredictable, overly emotional, and difficult to work with. Vincent, in turn, felt abandoned, anxious, and increasingly paranoid. The creative harmony he had dreamed of was unraveling before his eyes. On December 23rd, after a particularly heated argument, everything changed. That night, Gauguin stormed out. Some say he intended to leave Arles for good. According to one version of the story, Vincent followed him into the street, possibly holding a razor. But Gauguin walked away, and Vincent, alone, spiraling, returned home. In a state of utter distress, he took a blade and cut off part of his left ear. What drove him to do it? No one knows for sure. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was a desperate act of control in a world slipping away. Perhaps it was a cry no one had yet heard. He wrapped the severed ear in paper and brought it to a nearby brothel, handing it to a woman named Rachel. Then he collapsed. The next morning, he was found unconscious and rushed to the hospital. Word spread through Arles that the local artist had lost his mind. Crowds gathered outside the hospital. Newspapers reported the incident. Gauguin left immediately for Paris. He and Vincent would never see each other again. While Vincent recovered physically, his mental health became increasingly fragile. He suffered hallucinations and memory loss. He would cry without knowing why. He begged Theo to visit and wrote letters filled with confusion, sadness, and shame. Despite everything, he continued to paint. In the hospital courtyard, he found solace in small things: a garden, a bench, a moment of light. He painted the courtyard of the hospital in Arles, self-portrait with bandaged ear, and the Red Vineyard, the latter being the only painting he ever sold in his lifetime. But something had broken, not just in his mind, but in his heart. The yellow house, the dream, the sanctuary, was now empty. Vincent was alone again, surrounded by whispers, watched with suspicion, his place in the town no longer welcome. And so, with sorrow and consent, he committed himself to an asylum. The ear was gone, the friend had left. But the artist remained. In May of 1889, Vincent van Gogh admitted himself to the Saint-Paul de Mossoul Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. The stone building, surrounded by gardens and olive trees, was once a monastery. Now it became a place of healing, or at least a place of quiet. For Vincent, it was both a prison and a sanctuary. His room had bars on the windows. There were long periods of silence, broken by distant cries from other patients. His days were filled with routine: meals, medication, rest. But whenever he was well enough, he painted. The asylum staff allowed him a studio space, and Vincent used it obsessively. He painted the view from his window again and again: cypress trees, swirling skies, golden fields. He painted flowers, corridors, and the hills beyond the asylum walls. And in a moment of uneasy calm, he painted one of his most iconic works, The Starry Night. The painting wasn't meant to be realistic, it was emotional. The sky pulses with motion, the stars burn like fire, and a quiet village sleeps below. Vincent called it a failure. The world much later would disagree. Though his mental health fluctuated, his creativity surged. He completed nearly 150 paintings in a year, many now considered masterpieces: irises, the olive trees, the bedroom, and Wheatfield with Reaper, each a blend of peace and chaos, light and suffering. But he was never free of the darkness. He experienced terrifying episodes, periods of confusion, panic, and silence. At times he couldn't remember what he had painted. Other times he feared his mind was slipping away forever. He once swallowed paint and turpentine, an act of self-harm that left him weak and shaken. Still, he held on. Throughout it all, he wrote letters to Theo, page after page, filled with thoughts about color, brushwork, emotion, and hope. He tried to explain the unexplainable, what it felt like to fall apart while creating something beautiful. Despite everything, he believed in his work. "What would life be," he wrote, "if we didn't have the courage to try anything?" In the walls of that asylum, Vincent was broken, and yet, in those same walls, he created some of the most powerful art the world would ever know. A man losing his mind, yet finding his soul on every canvas. By May of 1890, Vincent van Gogh left the asylum in Saint-Rémy. His health had improved, and though still fragile, he was eager to return to the outside world. At the suggestion of his physician, he moved to the quiet village of Auvers-sur-Oise, just north of Paris. It was peaceful, filled with open skies, winding paths, and golden wheat fields, landscapes that suited him. More importantly, it was near Theo. Theo, his brother and lifeline, had recently married and become a father. Vincent was happy for him, but he felt a quiet fear growing, fear that he might become a burden, that the financial support, the emotional weight, the worry he caused was too much. He never said it outright, but his letters hinted at it. His tone had changed. Gratitude was now laced with guilt. In Auvers, Vincent was under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician with an interest in art and melancholy. Vincent painted his portrait twice. "He's sicker than I am," he wrote to Theo, half joking, half serious. But despite his doubts and inner turmoil, Vincent was painting more than ever. In just 70 days, he created more than 70 works. Fields under stormy skies, roads lined with poplars, a church twisting slightly as if seen in a dream. Each painting seemed urgent, vivid, powerful, heavy with emotion. He was pouring everything he had left onto the canvas. And then it stopped. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into a wheat field carrying a revolver. No one knows exactly what he was thinking. Maybe he believed his time had come. Maybe he believed his work was done. He shot himself in the chest but survived the initial wound. Staggering back to his lodging, he was found bleeding and taken to bed. Theo rushed to be by his side. They spoke little, but the bond between them needed no words. Vincent, in pain but calm, whispered his final message: "The sadness will last forever." He died in Theo's arms 2 days later. The village buried him beneath a tree-lined hill, surrounded by the very fields he had painted. At the time of his death, Vincent van Gogh was unknown, uncelebrated, misunderstood. But in that silence, a legacy was just beginning to rise. Vincent van Gogh died believing he had failed. He sold just one painting in his lifetime. He was laughed at, misunderstood, pitied. The world never knew what to make of him until it was too late. 6 months after Vincent's death, Theo followed him. He died from illness, grief-stricken and exhausted, never knowing the impact his brother's work would one day have. But Theo's wife, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, stepped into the silence. She inherited hundreds of Vincent's paintings and letters, things most would have discarded. But she didn't see them as failures. She saw them as truth. Quietly, steadily, she began to share Vincent's story with the world. She organized exhibitions, published his letters, and connected his art with the soul behind the brush. What was once dismissed as madness began to be recognized as genius. The world that had turned its back on him began to listen. By the early 20th century, Vincent's work had found an audience, then a following, then a legacy. Museums displayed his pieces. Collectors fought to acquire them. Artists named him as their greatest inspiration. Critics rewrote their histories to include him. And with each passing decade, his name only grew. Today, the Starry Night hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, seen by millions. Sunflowers is considered one of the most recognizable paintings in the world. His letters, deeply human, painfully honest, are studied not just for their insight into art, but into the human condition itself. But Vincent's legacy isn't just in brushstrokes or museums. It's in the way we see pain and beauty now, in how we talk about mental health, isolation, sensitivity, and creativity. He showed us that struggle and genius are often intertwined, that even in despair we can create something luminous. He is perhaps the greatest example of someone who wasn't celebrated in his time, but whose time eventually came. Beneath a quiet hill in Auvers, Vincent lies beside Theo, two brothers forever linked, not just by blood, but by belief. Theo never stopped believing in Vincent, and now neither have we. From silence came color, from suffering, beauty, and from a lonely life, a voice that still speaks, softly, powerfully, to the world. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful. The birth of jazz didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come from fame, luxury, or polished music schools. It came from something much deeper, pain, resilience, and joy found in the cracks of hardship. Jazz was born out of real life. And real life, especially for the black communities in the American South, was marked by both suffering and spirit. After centuries of slavery, even freedom came with struggle. Racism, poverty, and exclusion defined the world outside. But inside churches, homes, and neighborhoods, people built something else. They built community. They built music. Songs became ways to remember, to mourn, to pray, and to celebrate. Drums carried memory. Voices carried history. Every rhythm was layered with something sacred and human. This is where jazz found its roots, not in a single song or solo, but in the way sorrow was carried with grace and turned into rhythm. It wasn't written down, it wasn't created for stages or critics. It happened in backyards, on street corners, and in late-night gatherings, where gospel met blues, where African rhythms collided with European harmonies, where people told their stories not with words but with sound. In New Orleans, the city where jazz would take its first breath, life was alive with music. Births, weddings, parades, even funerals had music at their center. A funeral might begin with slow, somber hymns, only to erupt into joyful brass music once the body had been laid to rest. It was a way of honoring both the sorrow of goodbye and the beauty of a life well lived. This balance between heartbreak and celebration became the heartbeat of jazz itself. In those early days, the music had no name. People just played. They mixed styles, they improvised. They followed feeling more than form. And slowly, a new sound began to take shape, one that couldn't be boxed in, one that bent the rules, invited mistakes, and welcomed freedom. That sound was jazz. It didn't erase sorrow. It danced with it. It didn't deny hardship. It transformed it. And in that transformation, something extraordinary was born. Jazz came from pain, but it carried joy. It carried life, and it carried the proof that even in the darkest places, something beautiful can rise. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was unlike any other city in America. It wasn't just a port city. It was a meeting place, a crossroad, a living, breathing blend of culture, language, history, and sound. This was where jazz would be born because no other place had the ingredients quite like this. The city was French, Spanish, African, Creole, Caribbean, Catholic, Protestant, enslaved, free, and everything in between. Each group brought its own traditions, music, instruments, and stories. And instead of remaining separate, these cultures collided every single day. In the French Quarter, you might hear operas or chamber music drifting from elegant salons. In Congo Square on Sundays, you'd find African rhythms in full force, drums, dances, and chants passed down for generations. Just a few streets away, gospel choirs filled churches, while marching bands practiced for parades. Street performers played ragtime on battered pianos. Children learned hymns by ear. Brass bands marched through the neighborhoods, their sounds spilling into every alley. Music was everywhere, and more importantly, it was shared. New Orleans was one of the few cities where people of different races and classes regularly heard one another's music. Musicians learned from each other, borrowing rhythms, phrases, and techniques. An old spiritual might inspire a new melody. A brass line from a parade could end up in a blues improvisation. There were no boundaries, just inspiration. The city's geography played a role too. Tight-knit neighborhoods meant that sound traveled easily. The call of a cornet or the beat of a drum could reach from one block to the next, drawing people in. A single porch performance could become a jam session by nightfall. This collision of cultures didn't happen peacefully. Segregation and racism were very real, but music found its way around those walls. It was the common language in a divided place. And in New Orleans, that language kept evolving. Out of this rich, noisy, soulful melting pot came something entirely new. Not classical, not folk, not blues, but something made from the pieces of all of them. The sound of jazz was forming, improvised, unpredictable, impossible to define. And no one city, except New Orleans, could have given it life. Long before jazz had a name, it had a heartbeat. That heartbeat came from Africa. For generations, enslaved Africans brought to America carried with them more than just survival. They carried memory, rhythm, and music. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, they held on to the sounds that reminded them of home. And in New Orleans, those sounds endured. The most famous space where these rhythms lived was Congo Square, a patch of land just outside the French Quarter. On Sundays, the only day enslaved people were allowed rest, They gathered to dance, play drums, sing, and share traditions. For a few hours, they reclaimed freedom through rhythm. What echoed through Congo Square wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural resistance. The call and response chants, the polyrhythmic drumming, the body movements, all were ties to identity, ancestry, and dignity. The square itself became sacred, pulsing with life in the face of oppression. Over time, those rhythms mixed with European instruments, fiddles, horns, and accordions. The banjo, descended from West African lutes, found its place alongside French melodies and Spanish guitar forms. The result was a sound that couldn't be traced to one source. It was the child of many. African influence also shaped the spirit of the music. In many West African cultures, music wasn't separate from life. It was life. It told stories, marked seasons, healed wounds, and brought communities together. That sense of music as emotion, as communication, found its way into every layer of jazz. From field hollers to work songs, spirituals to blues, the musical language of the African diaspora was alive and evolving. Each note carried weight, each beat had purpose. And from this emotional depth came the power of improvisation, expressing feeling in the moment, not through perfection, but through honesty. Jazz inherited that language. It didn't follow strict rules because life didn't either. It bent, shifted, responded. It felt. It was never just about technique, it was about truth. The echoes of Africa gave jazz its soul. They gave it rhythm that moved the body and pain that touched the heart. Jazz may have taken shape in America, but its roots dug deep into another continent. And those roots still hum beneath every horn, every drum, and every note played in its name. In the years following the Civil War, New Orleans found itself with something unexpected, leftover instruments. Brass horns, clarinets, drums, and tubas, once used by military bands, were no longer needed. They found their way into pawn shops, attics, and second-hand stores, gathering dust until curious hands brought them back to life. Those hands didn't belong to trained musicians. They belonged to ordinary people: barbers, butchers, shoe shiners, porters, men and boys who couldn't afford formal lessons, but who taught themselves by listening, feeling, experimenting. They took those brass instruments and made them speak in ways no one ever had before. The result wasn't polite, it wasn't proper. It was loud, raw, and full of soul. These self-taught musicians weren't reading sheet music. They were inventing their own language, bending notes, sliding between keys, mixing rhythms that weren't supposed to fit together. And in doing so, they made the instruments their own. The cornet became a voice for storytelling. The clarinet wove harmonies like a singer's sigh. The drums held it all together, steady but unpredictable. And the tuba, deep and round, gave the music its powerful heartbeat. Every street in New Orleans became a kind of classroom. Marching bands paraded through neighborhoods. Brass quartets played at fish fries, dances, and funerals. If a child had talent, he could learn just by watching and imitating. You didn't need to be rich, you just needed rhythm. Jazz was forming, not in pristine concert halls, but in motion. It was music you walked with, danced to, lived inside. Improvisation wasn't a trick, it was survival. If you dropped a note, you bent another to catch it. If you didn't know the tune, you made one up that fit. Jazz didn't punish mistakes, it turned them into opportunity. What began with leftover instruments became a revolution. These tools of military order were reborn as instruments of personal expression. They no longer marched to someone else's command. They swung, they swayed, they shouted with joy and pain. In New Orleans, brass wasn't just metal. It was magic. It was transformation. And it would soon become the voice of a whole new music, a music that would spread from those streets to the rest of the world. Charles Buddy Bolden was born in New Orleans in 1877. By the late 1890s, he was already making noise, quite literally. Bolden played the cornet, but not the way others did. His sound was louder, freer, and more emotional than anything the city had heard. They said when Bolden played, you didn't just listen, you felt it. He wasn't trained in music theory. He couldn't read sheet music, but he didn't need to. Bolden played from instinct. He took bits of ragtime, blues, gospel, and brass band marches, and stirred them together into something new. His music didn't fit into a box. It swung, it shouted, it mourned, it had soul. Crowds followed him, clubs filled when he performed. People would dance until dawn. His band played in dance halls and on street corners, at parades and parties, in rough neighborhoods and across the river. He became known for a song called Funky Butt, one of the first jazz tunes ever played, and one that captured the raw, unapologetic energy of his sound. But what made Bolden special wasn't just volume or improvisation, it was how human his playing was. His horn laughed, cried, flirted, and confessed. It spoke when words couldn't. Sadly, Bolden's light burned fast. In 1907, at just 30 years old, he suffered a mental breakdown. He was committed to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He never recorded a single note. No surviving audio exists of his playing. Everything we know comes from stories, passed down from musicians, dancers, and fans who remembered how he made them feel. Yet even without recordings, Bolden's influence echoes in the DNA of jazz. Musicians like Louis Armstrong would later credit him as the father of the sound. The way Bolden bent notes, improvised freely, and played with emotion set the tone for everyone who followed. He was a mystery, a myth, a man who created something immortal with nothing but a cornet, a wild heart, and a rhythm all his own. And though his voice was lost to time, his spirit lives on, in every solo, every swing, and every note played with soul. If Buddy Bolden was the wild flame that lit jazz's first spark, Jelly Roll Morton was the one who gave it shape. Born Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe in New Orleans in 1890, he gave himself the name Jelly Roll and called himself the inventor of jazz. A bold claim, but one rooted in real innovation. Where Bolden brought raw energy, Morton brought refinement. He didn't tame jazz's spirit, but he taught it how to dance in time. Jelly Roll was a pianist, a composer, and a storyteller. By his teenage years, he was playing in brothels, bars, and gambling dens, places where music had to be lively, seductive, and always entertaining. He soaked up every influence New Orleans had to offer. Spanish melodies, ragtime rhythms, Creole folk songs, and African American blues. Then he blended them into his own signature sound. What made Morton different was his ability to write jazz down. He composed intricate arrangements for multiple instruments, turning jam sessions into orchestrated experiences. His famous Red Hot Peppers recordings weren't just performances. They were carefully crafted pieces, filled with syncopation, breaks, and unexpected shifts. Still, Jelly Roll never lost the spirit of improvisation. He left space in his compositions for soloists to shine, for riffs to grow, for surprise to sneak in. He believed jazz wasn't just music, it was feeling, style, and attitude. And he wore that belief like a badge, often dressing in sharp suits and speaking with showman's flair. In 1926, when he recorded Black Bottom Stomp and Dr. Jazz, the world began to listen. His music traveled far beyond New Orleans, reaching Chicago and New York, helping plant jazz firmly on the national stage. But Jelly Roll's importance goes beyond his compositions. He proved that jazz could be both spontaneous and structured, that it didn't have to choose between freedom and form. And he gave future musicians a blueprint, a way to write, record, and preserve a sound that had been mostly passed down by ear. Some say he exaggerated his role in jazz's birth, but even if he didn't invent it, he shaped it, framed it, and pushed it forward. Jelly Roll Morton gave jazz its first spine, and yet it still danced. If jazz had a heartbeat, it would sound a lot like Louis Armstrong. Born in 1901 in one of New Orleans' roughest neighborhoods, an area known as the Battlefield, Armstrong came into a world of poverty and hardship. His father left early, and his mother often struggled to make ends meet. As a boy, he worked odd jobs to help his family, and one day, after firing a pistol in celebration on New Year's Eve, he was arrested and sent to a home for troubled boys. But that home changed everything. There, Louis was introduced to the cornet, and from the moment he held it, something awakened inside him. Music became his voice, his escape, and soon his identity. He learned quickly, listened deeply, and absorbed everything from the local players around him, especially his idol, King Oliver, one of New Orleans' top band leaders at the time. By the early 1920s, Armstrong had joined Oliver's band in Chicago. His sound was unmistakable, warm, bold, and full of life. Unlike many musicians of the day, Armstrong didn't just blend in with the band. He stood out. His solos sang. They soared. And when he began to sing too, with that gravelly, joyful voice, he won hearts instantly. Armstrong brought something to jazz that hadn't been fully realized before: personality. He turned solos into conversations. He made his trumpet laugh, weep, dance, and dream. His recordings with the Hot 5 and Hot 7 bands like West End Blues and Heebie Jeebies weren't just performances, they were moments. Scat singing, which he popularized by accident when he dropped his lyric sheet mid-recording, became a jazz staple. And his smile, wide, sincere, and full of mischief, became a symbol of the joy jazz could bring. Louis Armstrong didn't invent jazz, but he gave it its soul. He turned a regional sound into a global voice. He crossed racial barriers with his music, inspiring audiences of all colors and generations. Where others played notes, Louis told stories. He showed the world that jazz wasn't just music, it was feeling. And no one felt it more deeply, or shared it more generously, than the man from the battlefield with a trumpet in his hands and the world in his heart. As jazz began to travel, north to Chicago, east to New York, and eventually around the world, New Orleans remained its sacred home. While other cities added their own styles and spins, the streets of the Crescent City held on to the original spirit. There, jazz never became just a genre. It stayed something living, breathing, and communal. In New Orleans, jazz wasn't only for nightclubs or concert halls, it was part of everyday life. You could hear it in neighborhood parades, birthday parties, street performances, and most famously, in jazz funerals. These were not quiet, solemn affairs. They were emotional journeys, starting with sorrow and ending in celebration. A jazz funeral would begin with a slow, mournful hymn. The band played in minor keys, matching the weight of grief. But once the body was laid to rest, the music would transform. The tempo would rise, the horns would dance, people would clap, spin umbrellas, and form a second line, a group of dancers and followers who turned mourning into movement. That spirit, the ability to honor pain while embracing joy, was at the heart of New Orleans jazz. Even as the music industry evolved and jazz gave way to swing, bebop, and later fusion and modern interpretations, New Orleans held tight to the early traditions. Musicians passed songs down by ear, not just through lessons, but through living the music. Children grew up watching uncles and neighbors play on porches and street corners. Instruments were often shared. Bands were made of cousins, classmates, and old friends. This wasn't nostalgia, it was legacy, a living thread that tied each generation to the next. New Orleans jazz also remained deeply tied to place. You could walk through the French Quarter and still hear the same rhythms that Buddy Bolden might have played over 100 years earlier. Brass bands marched through the same streets. Clubs like Preservation Hall kept the old songs alive, not as museum pieces, but as expressions of the now. In a city shaped by joy and tragedy, floods and festivals, jazz was the music that carried its soul. It had survived wars, poverty, racism, and even natural disasters. Because jazz wasn't just something New Orleans created, it was something it needed. A voice that had never stopped singing. Jazz was never just music. It was a heartbeat, a protest, a prayer. It was laughter at the end of sorrow. It was survival dressed in rhythm. And though its sound has shifted over time, its spirit, the part born on the streets of New Orleans, has never faded. In the century since its creation, jazz has traveled far. It's been reimagined in smoky New York clubs, echoed through European concert halls, and blended into genres from hip-hop to rock to classical. It became a language spoken across cultures, a symbol of freedom, creativity, and soul. But no matter how far it reached, jazz never forgot where it came from. it never left behind the pain, joy, and improvisation that gave it life. At its best, it still carries that same energy, the spirit that says, I will make beauty from whatever I'm given. That spirit lived in Buddy Bolden's cornet, blasting across open fields with no recording to prove he was ever there. It lived in Jelly Roll Morton's piano, crafting jazz's first compositions while still leaving room for surprise. It lived in Louis Armstrong's trumpet and voice, breaking barriers and melting hearts with every note. And it lives on today in the parades of New Orleans, in the fingers of young musicians learning old songs, in the second lines that dance through city streets, refusing to let grief walk alone. It lives in the silence before a solo, in the swing of a brushed snare, in the cry of a saxophone that can't be explained. Jazz endures not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It was born from sorrow and shaped by joy. It grew through struggle and rose through hope. It taught the world that music doesn't need a script, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to feel, to improvise, and to keep going. From the cracked sidewalks of New Orleans came something eternal. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful. And though the names may change, the instruments may shift, and the songs may evolve, the soul of jazz plays on, softly, boldly, always. The morning of December 7th, 1941, began quietly at Pearl Harbor, a sprawling naval base nestled along the southern coast of Oahu, Hawaii. The sun rose gently over the Pacific, casting a warm glow across the waters. Palm trees swayed in the light breeze. Seagulls floated overhead. The ships in the harbor, some of the most powerful in the U.S. Navy, rested at anchor, gleaming in the morning light. For the men stationed there, it was a Sunday like any other, a day of rest. Some slept in, grateful for the slower pace. Others wrote letters home, drank coffee, or read the paper. Church services were being prepared. Breakfast was served in mess halls. For the lucky few, it was a chance to enjoy the beach or head into town. There was no reason to be alarmed, no tension in the air, no sense of threat. Hawaii, for all its strategic importance, felt worlds away from the war unfolding in Europe and Asia. Life at Pearl Harbor moved with a sense of order, routine, and comfort. Aboard the battleships, sailors performed their usual duties. Some were scrubbing decks, others stood watch. Officers checked rosters, mechanics inspected equipment. The massive vessels, the Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and others, were quiet, alive with activity, but unaware of what was coming. Out on the airfields nearby, Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows, pilots and ground crews went about their usual checks. The planes were parked in neat rows, wings exposed, unguarded. No one expected trouble. In those early hours, everything felt normal. Yet, just a few hundred miles away, a Japanese strike force was already airborne. Over 180 planes moving silently across the ocean, flying low under the radar. Their mission: deliver a surprise attack that would cripple the United States Pacific Fleet in a single blow. But here, on the ground at Pearl Harbor, there was no warning. Just the usual hum of engines, the smell of salt in the air, and the quiet sounds of morning routines. It was a peaceful moment. The last one many would ever know. In less than an hour, this calm would vanish, shattered by fire, steel, and history. But for now, it was just a morning like any other. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the sky over Pearl Harbor changed. Without warning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept in from the north, 183 planes in total. Fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes filled the horizon in tight formation, their engines roaring low above the water. To those on the ground, it was sudden and surreal. A sound that didn't belong to Sunday. The calm morning shattered. Within seconds, the air erupted with the sound of machine guns, bomb blasts, and screaming engines. The Japanese planes dove toward the harbor with terrifying precision, targeting battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and airfields in synchronized waves. Sailors aboard the ships scrambled to action stations, many barefoot, shirtless, still pulling on their uniforms as they ran. but there was little time to react. Bombs exploded on decks. Torpedoes streaked through the water, slamming into hulls. Planes dropped from the sky like thunderbolts. On the ground, chaos broke out at Hickam Field and other nearby air bases. Aircraft were lined up wing to wing, perfect targets for strafing runs and incendiary bombs. Hangars burst into flames. Barracks were torn apart. Men grabbed rifles and fired into the sky with little effect. The USS Arizona took a direct hit to her forward magazine. The explosion was instant, catastrophic. A column of fire shot high into the sky, and the ship began to sink immediately, dragging hundreds of men down with her. The USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes, capsizing in under 15 minutes. Trapped sailors banged on the overturned hull, hoping someone would hear them. Some were rescued, many were not. Smoke rose across the harbor, thick and choking. Burning oil covered the water's surface, igniting as sailors dove in, trying to escape. The air was filled with the sounds of alarms, shouting, and the steady, relentless assault from above. The Japanese had achieved total surprise. For many, the attack seemed to last forever. In reality, it was just over 90 minutes from start to finish. But in that brief window of time, a quiet harbor became a battlefield. Ships were torn apart, lives were lost, and the illusion of safety in paradise was gone forever. The day was no longer peaceful. It was a turning point in history, written in fire. Pearl Harbor had been built to protect. A fortress of ships, steel, and strength, lined with battleships thought to be invincible. But on the morning of December 7th, that illusion was torn apart. The Japanese attack focused on the heart of American naval power. The Pacific Fleet anchored in the harbor. 8 battleships sat quietly in the water, unaware they were moments away from disaster. The USS Arizona, majestic and imposing, was among the first struck. A bomb pierced her deck and detonated a massive ammunition magazine. The ship exploded with such force that it lifted out of the water before breaking apart and sinking. Flames shot into the sky. 177 men died in an instant, many never identified, many never found. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma took multiple torpedoes. Within minutes, she capsized, rolling over and trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. Some were rescued by frantic efforts, men cutting through steel with torches to free the survivors. But 429 lives were lost, most of them in total darkness with water rising. The USS West Virginia, California, and Nevada were all hit hard. Torpedoes punched through their sides, bombs exploded above decks, fires spread uncontrollably. Sailors fought back, but with little time and few weapons ready, their options were limited. Some ships, like the USS Nevada, tried to escape. The Nevada attempted to steam out of the harbor under heavy fire. Her crew managed to beach her to prevent blocking the channel, a desperate, heroic act in the middle of chaos. In total, 21 ships were damaged or destroyed, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Dockside facilities, fuel tanks, and repair yards also took hits. The harbor, once a place of routine and safety, had been turned into a floating graveyard. The wreckage smoldered long after the attack ended. Fires burned into the night. Bodies were pulled from the water, many unrecognizable. Oil leaked from sunken ships, leaving a slick that would stain the water for days, and still seeps from the Arizona today. The Japanese strike had been brutal and effective. The pride of the American Pacific Fleet lay broken. Not a single enemy ship was lost. But something else, something more powerful than steel, had been stirred awake, and the world would soon feel it. While ships burned and explosions tore through steel, it was the people, the sailors, the soldiers, the nurses, the civilians, who bore the weight of that morning. The attack on Pearl Harbor claimed 2,403 American lives. Of those, over 100 died aboard the USS Arizona alone. Many were young men, some barely out of high school. They had enlisted in peace, but died in war, without warning, without a chance to fight back. In the confusion, many never made it to their posts. Some were still in their bunks when the bombs fell. Others died at their stations, doing their duty as their ships went down. There were acts of bravery everywhere. Sailors dragging wounded comrades to safety, diving into flaming waters, manning guns with bare hands and no orders, only instinct. On land, the carnage was just as real. Civilians and military personnel alike were caught in the crossfire at airfields like Hickam Field and Wheeler Army Airfield. Bombs tore through barracks. Planes were destroyed on the ground. Those who survived helped carry the wounded, turning hangars into emergency triage centers. With supplies short and chaos all around, medical teams used anything they could. Kitchen tables became operating surfaces, belts turned into tourniquets. At the Naval Hospital, doctors worked for hours without rest. Blood stained every floor. The sound of incoming wounded never stopped. There were not enough stretchers, not enough hands. And then there were those who lived but carried invisible wounds. Survivors spoke of the screams trapped inside the overturned Oklahoma, where men knocked on the hull for hours, of shipmates who never surfaced, of the helplessness of watching a friend engulfed in flame, unable to reach him in time. Some men were the only survivors from their ship. Others bore burns, shrapnel wounds, or permanent hearing loss. Many carried the trauma of that morning silently for the rest of their lives. They had lived, but in many ways they had been changed forever. The destruction of ships could be measured in steel and tonnage, but the true cost of Pearl Harbor was measured in lives. Lives lost, lives broken, lives that would never be the same. War had come suddenly, and it had come with a terrible price. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't a random act of aggression. It was a calculated strike, designed with precision and secrecy. For months, the Japanese military had been preparing. Plans were drawn, models were built. Pilots trained relentlessly. Every detail had a purpose, every target, a role in a larger vision. Japan's leaders believed war with the United States was inevitable. Tensions had been building for years. The US had imposed economic sanctions, including a crippling oil embargo, in response to Japan's expansion through China and Southeast Asia. Faced with dwindling resources and growing resistance, Japan saw only two choices: withdraw from its ambitions or neutralize America before it could respond. They chose the latter. The goal of the attack on Pearl Harbor was simple: cripple the US. Pacific Fleet so thoroughly that America would be forced to accept Japan's dominance in the Pacific. By knocking out battleships, airfields, and fuel reserves, Japan hoped to buy time, 6 months to a year, to secure territory in the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. A quick and overwhelming start, they believed, would force America to negotiate, not retaliate. The operation was planned under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who knew the risks. He had studied in the United States and understood American industry and willpower. In private, he expressed doubt, famously warning, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." But once the decision was made, Yamamoto executed it flawlessly. On December 7th, 6 aircraft carriers, more than 400 planes, and a fleet of battleships and cruisers launched the surprise attack. The strike force had sailed over 3,000 miles, undetected, through the northern Pacific. It was one of the most daring naval operations in history, and on a tactical level it worked. Battleships were sunk, airfields were destroyed, America was caught off guard. But Japan had miscalculated one thing: the American spirit. The hoped for negotiation never came. The expected surrender turned instead into full-scale mobilization. The attack didn't intimidate, it united. And instead of weakening the United States, it forged a resolve stronger than Japan had ever imagined. Pearl Harbor was their opening move, but it also marked the beginning of their eventual defeat. The morning after the attack, December 8, 1941, the United States was no longer the same country it had been the day before. Across the nation, people gathered around radios in kitchens, shops, and schools, listening for clarity, for comfort, for answers. What they heard was the voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, calm but resolute, as he addressed a joint session of Congress and, by extension, the world. He began with a line that would echo through generations. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. He spoke for just 7 minutes, but in those minutes He gave voice to a wounded but determined nation. Roosevelt described the deliberate and unprovoked attack by the Empire of Japan and laid out with unmistakable clarity that the United States had been thrust into war. Congress responded immediately. The vote to declare war on Japan passed with near unanimity, only one vote opposed. Just one day after the attack, America was officially at war. 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. The US responded in kind. In less than a week, a nation that had hoped to avoid war was fully involved in World War II, on both the Pacific and European fronts. The mood across America shifted overnight. The debate between isolationists and interventionists was over. Factories that once made automobiles now produced tanks and planes. Young men lined up outside recruitment centers. Families rationed food, collected scrap metal, and planted victory gardens. A nation had been attacked, and it answered not with retreat, but with resolve. Roosevelt's speech did more than declare war. It gave the American people direction. It defined the moment not just as a tragedy, but as a call to action. A moment of sorrow, yes, but also of unity and purpose. Pearl Harbor was no longer just a place. It had become a symbol of what was lost and what would rise in its place. From the ashes of the harbor came a declaration. From that declaration came a war effort. And from that war effort, history would be rewritten. December 7th had changed everything, and America would never forget. Before Pearl Harbor, America was a nation divided, caught between the instinct to stay out of foreign wars and the growing awareness that the world was slipping into chaos. Europe was already in flames. Hitler's armies had swept across the continent. Japan had invaded China and threatened Southeast Asia. But still, many Americans believed it wasn't their fight. That changed in a single morning. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed isolation into action. The debate was over. America was now fully involved, not just emotionally, but militarily, economically, and politically. And from that moment forward, the United States would become a decisive force in the outcome of World War II. Factories roared to life. Assembly lines that once built cars and appliances began churning out tanks, planes, rifles, and warships. This shift, called the Arsenal of Democracy, turned the US into the world's largest producer of war materials. In time, American factories would outbuild all Axis powers combined. Young men enlisted by the millions. Some volunteered the very next day. Others were drafted. Boys from small towns and big cities alike put on uniforms and shipped out to distant parts of the world. Many had never left their home states. Now they found themselves in Europe, North Africa, or across the Pacific. Women stepped into roles they'd never held before, working in factories, shipyards, and offices. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of the new American workforce, strong, capable, and vital to victory. The government mobilized too. Rationing, war bonds, propaganda campaigns, and scientific innovation. All were part of a national effort that touched every American home. And beyond the borders, alliances began to solidify. The US joined the Allies, working with Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other nations to push back the tide of fascism and imperial aggression. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been meant to destroy American power, but it did the opposite. It ignited it. It focused it. And in doing so, it reshaped not only the war, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century. A single morning of violence had awakened a sleeping giant. And from that awakening came a force that would help liberate the world and define it for generations to come. For those who lived through the attack on Pearl Harbor, the war didn't end when the bombing stopped. Survival, for many, came with a heavy burden. In the days that followed, the harbor was quiet again, but not in the same way. The water, once calm and reflective, now held wreckage and oil slicks. Burned ships sat half sunken. The smell of smoke lingered in the air. Divers were sent into the wrecks, not just to salvage equipment, but to recover the dead. Some bodies would never be found. For the survivors, the trauma wasn't something they could leave behind. Many had lost friends, bunkmates, brothers, men they had eaten breakfast with only hours before. They had witnessed horror in its rawest form. Ships exploding, men jumping into burning water, entire crews disappearing beneath the waves. Some bore physical wounds, burns, shrapnel, broken limbs. Others walked away without a scratch, but with memories they could never erase. Sounds, smells, and sights that returned in dreams. Some never spoke of it again. Others relived it every day. This was the invisible weight of survival. Some survivors experienced guilt. Why them and not someone else? Why had they been spared while others were trapped or killed? These questions, unanswerable and haunting, followed them long after the war ended. Yet amid the pain, many found ways to honor what they had endured. They told their stories. They visited memorials. They returned to Pearl Harbor year after year, standing quietly on the deck of the USS Arizona Memorial, looking down into the water where their shipmates still rest. And as the decades passed, their voices became part of a larger memory, not just of loss, but of resilience. These men and women, some just teenagers at the time, carried the memory of Pearl Harbor with them into every corner of their lives. Into the families they built, the jobs they worked, the country they helped rebuild. They didn't seek fame. Most didn't call themselves heroes, but they were. The attack on Pearl Harbor broke something open in the world. But in its aftermath, the survivors showed something even stronger, the power to endure, to rebuild, and to carry the stories of the fallen forward so that they would never be forgotten. Today, Pearl Harbor is not just a military base. It is a place of remembrance. More than 80 years have passed since the morning of December 7, 1941, but the memory remains vivid, preserved in history, retold by generations, and honored by those who still walk its shores. The harbor that once echoed with explosions and sirens now holds a calm silence, broken only by the sound of waves and the gentle hum of passing boats. At the center of this memory floats the USS Arizona Memorial, a white structure that spans the sunken battleship below. It stands not in grandeur, but in reverence. Beneath it lie the remains of over 900 sailors, still entombed in the ship's rusting hull. Drops of oil continue to rise to the surface. Black tears, some call them, a steady, solemn reminder of lives lost. Each year, survivors, veterans, families, and visitors from around the world come to this place. They stand in silence, read the names engraved in marble, and remember what was sacrificed. Some place lays in the water, others simply pause, heads bowed, watching as history quietly breathes beneath the waves. Remembering Pearl Harbor isn't just about honoring those who died. It's about understanding what was awakened that day, the strength of a nation, the unity of a people, the resilience of those who lived through it. As the years pass, the number of living survivors continues to dwindle. Most who were there that day are now gone. But their stories live on in letters, interviews, museums, and memorials. In classrooms and documentaries, in the quiet words shared between grandparents and grandchildren. The lessons of Pearl Harbor are not only about war, they are about peace, vigilance, and memory. They remind us how quickly the world can change, how deeply loss can be felt, and how vital it is to remember the past so we don't repeat it. December 7th, 1941 was a day of devastation, but from its ashes rose determination, and through remembrance, that spirit continues to guide us. Pearl Harbor is not forgotten. It is remembered, in silence, in reverence, and in the echo of every name spoken aloud. Long before the age of science, before the telescope and the observatory, there were only the skies, and the people who watched them. In ancient Babylon, stargazing didn't begin with tools. It began with wonder. Night after night, long before clocks or calendars existed, people looked up. There were no distractions, no light pollution. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, sharp, quiet, and full of mystery. The Babylonians didn't see the stars as distant objects of cold physics. They saw them as living signs, symbols, the movements of gods across a heavenly stage, and they watched with intent, knowing that whatever played out above would eventually echo below. It's easy to forget in our modern world just how much they accomplished with nothing but the naked eye. There were no lenses to magnify the stars, no satellites to scan the heavens, no math beyond what was written by hand. Yet somehow they began to map the sky. They noticed that certain stars rose in the east at the same time every year, that the moon followed a pattern, that Venus disappeared and returned. These weren't fleeting observations. The Babylonians committed themselves to years, decades of observation. Fathers taught sons, priests trained apprentices. Knowledge passed quietly, like fire from one torch to another. They weren't just curious. For them, watching the sky was essential. It was part of agriculture, of religion, of governance. The sky could foretell famine or fortune. It could bless a king or warn of his downfall. And so they watched, from rooftops, from temple courtyards, and eventually from towering ziggurats. They kept their eyes on the heavens. What they saw would lay the foundation for something extraordinary. The Babylonian stargazers had no telescopes, but they had time, they had patience, they had stories, and most of all, they had a belief that the sky was speaking, and that it was their duty to listen. This wasn't science as we know it, it was the beginning of science. Rooted in myth, refined by memory, and driven by an unshakable desire to understand the rhythm of the stars. And in that silence above the desert, the first astronomers were born. To understand the stargazers of Babylon, we must first understand the land they stood upon. Ancient Babylon was nestled in the heart of Mesopotamia, between the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates. It was a place of contrasts, fertile fields fed by irrigation, vast stretches of desert, and skies that seemed to go on forever. The horizon was open, unbroken, the stars brilliant, and at night the heavens became a living tapestry. In a world without electricity or city lights, the night sky was not a mystery hidden behind haze. It was a daily spectacle. Every star, every phase of the moon, every shift in the planets was visible and clear. For the Babylonians, the sky wasn't distant, it was present, hanging directly over their lives like a great dome of stories and signs. This land gave rise to one of the first great civilizations, rich in language, religion, trade, and law. But beyond farming and building, the Babylonians nurtured a deep connection to the heavens. They believed their gods lived above, moving across the sky in celestial bodies. Every change in the stars was a whisper of divine intent. The cycles of the stars helped the Babylonians measure time. Calendars were built around the moon's phases. Seasons were predicted by the return of certain stars on the horizon. When would the rivers flood? When should the barley be planted? The answers were above. But the stars weren't just clocks. They were omens. If a star vanished unexpectedly, it could mean war. If Mars burned red near the moon, it might signal the death of a king. The Babylonians looked for these signs carefully, believing the sky held warnings, if only they could read them in time. Their land, with its broad skies, slow-moving rivers, and spiritual imagination, invited this kind of thought. There was time to look up. There was meaning in looking up, and so, in this cradle of civilization, between two rivers under an ancient sky, a new form of knowledge began to take root, part science, part belief, and entirely bound to the stars. It was in this land that the ancient Babylonians began their long watch. In ancient Babylon, stargazing wasn't a pastime. It was a sacred responsibility, carried out by a select few who were trusted not just with knowledge, but with meaning. These were the astral priests, part scientists, part prophets. They belonged to a class known as the Baru or diviners, religious officials whose role was to interpret signs from the gods. Among them were those whose gaze turned skyward, night after night, to read the heavens like a divine script. They were not ordinary priests. Their work required patience, precision, and discipline. These men were educated in mathematics, writing, and observation. They kept meticulous records, etching their findings into clay tablets using cuneiform script, the earliest known writing system. These tablets didn't just describe what was seen, they interpreted it. Every comet, every planetary alignment, every strange shadow cast on the moon was logged alongside its possible meaning. The priests believed the sky was not random, it was ordered, deliberate, a reflection of divine will. The gods were not silent. They were speaking through the movements of stars and planets. It was up to the priest to listen carefully, to understand, and then to advise the king or the people. Their work had weight. A single celestial event could affect royal decisions. Wars were declared or avoided based on planetary patterns. Festivals were planned with lunar cycles. Crops were planted only after the stars gave their silent approval. But these priests were also careful scientists, though they wouldn't have called themselves that. They charted rising and setting times, tracked the retrograde motion of planets, and counted lunar months. Over time, they began to predict when certain events would recur. What began as observation slowly turned into forecasting. And this work wasn't done in secrecy. It was part of a broader system of temple scholarship. Knowledge was preserved, passed down, and refined over centuries. Each priest built upon the work of those who came before him. In the quiet stillness of night, high above the city or deep within temple courtyards, these early astronomers studied the sky, not with curiosity alone, but with devotion. They weren't just watching the stars. They believed they were communing with the divine. And in doing so, they became the world's first true interpreters of the cosmos. In the heart of Babylonian cities, great towers rose above the rooftops, ziggurats, monumental stair-stepped structures built of sun-dried mud bricks. These weren't palaces or tombs, they were temples, sacred spaces meant to bridge the distance between earth and sky. To the Babylonians, ziggurats were more than architecture. They were cosmic ladders, connecting the human world to the divine. Each one was dedicated to a specific god and stood as a symbolic mountain in the flat Mesopotamian landscape. But they also served a more earthly function. They became the earliest observatories. High atop the ziggurat, away from the flicker of firelight and the noise of city life, Babylonian priests found a perfect place to observe the heavens. These towering platforms gave them a clear, uninterrupted view of the sky, a place to watch the stars rise and set, to track the movement of the moon and planets, and to seek signs from the gods above. The most famous of these was the Etemenanki, the ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk in the city of Babylon. Though only ruins remain today, ancient texts describe it as reaching hundreds of feet into the air, an enormous presence in the center of the city, visible from miles around. From these heights, the priest astronomers worked in silence, wrapped in robes, scanning the stars with trained eyes. They would record their findings on clay tablets stored in temple libraries below. Each night sky became part of a larger record, a story that stretched across generations. Climbing the ziggurat was a spiritual act, but also a practical one. The higher they went, the closer they felt to the gods, and the clearer the stars became. These platforms didn't have domes or telescopes, but they were designed with purpose, solid foundations that aligned with key celestial events. Some ziggurats were even oriented with cardinal directions, hinting at the deep connection between architecture, astronomy, and faith. In Babylon, the sacred and the scientific were never separate. Every brick of a ziggurat supported not just a structure, but a worldview, one where the sky was both a mystery and a message. And at the top of those ancient steps, the world's first stargazers reached upward, not just to see, but to understand. Night after night, the Babylonian sky came alive with movement. For the ancient stargazers, it wasn't chaos, it was choreography. The heavens danced in patterns, and if one looked carefully enough, those patterns revealed meaning. Among all the celestial bodies, the moon and Venus held special significance. The moon was familiar, ever-changing yet constant. The Babylonians tracked its phases carefully: new moon, waxing crescent, full, waning. They watched how its light waxed and faded over a 29-day cycle, aligning their calendar to its rhythm. Lunar months formed the backbone of their timekeeping, determining everything from religious festivals to the timing of harvests. They also noticed that eclipses, rare and mysterious, seemed to follow the moon. Over time, they began recording not just when eclipses occurred, but where in the sky they happened and what phase the moon was in at the time. This careful tracking would later lead them to predict such events with remarkable accuracy. Then there was Venus, the morning and evening star. To the Babylonians, Venus wasn't just a planet. It was the celestial form of the goddess Ishtar, a symbol of love, war, and fertility. Venus appeared bright, moved quickly, and often disappeared from the sky altogether before reappearing in a different place. This strange looping movement fascinated the Babylonian priests. They recorded each of Venus's appearances in detail, its first rising in the morning, its last setting at night, and the number of days it vanished from view. Over time, they discovered a cycle of 584 days, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position in the sky relative to Earth. Such precision is astonishing when we remember they had no telescopes, only trained eyes and centuries of continuous observation. They watched Mars too. When it moved forward, slowed, stopped, and then moved backward in the sky. This strange phenomenon, now known as retrograde motion, puzzled many later astronomers. But the Babylonians already had it recorded. To them, the sky was alive, filled with moving parts. Each planet, each phase of the moon, each blinking star telling a story. And through patient watching, they began to understand that what looked random was actually a dance, a slow, beautiful, divine rhythm. And they were determined to follow its steps. To most ancient people, a lunar eclipse was a moment of mystery, terrifying, unexpected, and divine. The full moon, shining brightly one moment, would slowly darken, then turn a deep shade of red, as if the gods themselves were casting shadows upon it. But for the stargazers of Babylon, eclipses were not frightening. They were foreseeable. Using nothing but their eyes, careful timing, and generations of records, the Babylonians became the first known civilization to predict eclipses. No glass lenses, no telescopes. Only clay tablets, symbols, and extraordinary patience. They noticed something most people wouldn't. Eclipses weren't random. They came in patterns, and those patterns repeated. By comparing records over many years, they discovered a cycle now known as the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. After this time, the Earth, Moon, and Sun would return to nearly the same alignment, and a similar eclipse would occur again. They didn't understand why it worked, not in the scientific sense we use today, but they knew it did. And they used that knowledge to forecast future eclipses, remarkably close to the dates we can confirm with modern astronomy. When they recorded eclipses, they didn't just note the date. They included details, how long the eclipse lasted, how much of the moon darkened, and sometimes what the sky looked like before and after. These descriptions were written on cuneiform tablets, many of which still survive today. Some even included interpretations. If an eclipse happened on the 14th day of the lunar month, it might signal danger for the king. If it occurred closer to the beginning, it might be a warning for the people. The sky wasn't just a calendar, it was a code waiting to be read. That the Babylonians could do this, predict cosmic events, without advanced tools, is a testament to their dedication. It was slow work, done over centuries, with each generation refining what the last had seen. They didn't just witness the beauty of the eclipse, they understood its rhythm, and in doing so, they turned the unpredictable into the expected, transforming fear into foresight and mystery into mastery. If you want to understand how the Babylonians viewed the stars, you don't need a telescope, you need a tablet. Buried beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of clay tablets. Many are economic records or royal decrees, but some contain something far more timeless, the stars. Written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of the region, these tablets hold the earliest known astronomical records. Etched carefully with reed styluses, they tell of planetary risings, lunar eclipses, solar positions, and star groupings. They are simple in form, but staggering in significance. These tablets were not decorative or symbolic. They were data, the result of patient nightly observation, logged not for poetry, but for prediction. Each entry was part of a larger effort to understand the heavens not just spiritually, but mathematically. One of the most famous collections comes from the city of Uruk, were tablets dating back to the 7th century BCE detail observations of Venus, complete with rising and setting times, gaps in visibility, and cyclic patterns. These records show not only recognition of Venus's unique motion, but a clear grasp of its repetition over time. Even more astonishing is how advanced their numerical methods were. The Babylonians used a base 60 system, what we still use today, to divide hours and angles. They could calculate time, distance across the sky, and the length of lunar months with surprising accuracy. Some tablets contained procedure texts, mathematical formulas used to model the movements of planets. These weren't guesses. They were the beginnings of scientific astronomy. Though the language on the tablets may seem cryptic now, scholars today can match many of the recorded events to verified astronomical occurrences, confirming eclipses and planetary alignments that happened over 2,500 years ago. And beyond their numbers, the tablets offer us something more, a glimpse into the minds of those who first looked up and decided to write it down. They didn't just observe the cosmos, they archived it, preserved it, passed it forward. Long after the stars they studied had shifted, long after their ziggurats crumbled and their cities fell, their records endured, waiting beneath the dust to speak once more. In those clay tablets, the ancient skies are still alive. For the Babylonians, the line between astronomy and astrology didn't exist. The stars weren't just celestial objects, they were messages, signs, warnings, blessings. The sky was not separate from life below, it was a mirror of it. They believed the heavens were ruled by the gods. Each celestial body moved according to divine will. The moon, the sun, the planets, they weren't just natural phenomena. They were the eyes and hands of deities. And their movements told a story, if one had the wisdom to read it. When a planet moved unusually, or an eclipse darkened the moon, it wasn't simply a physical event, it was a signal. Perhaps a king was in danger. Perhaps a neighboring city would rise or fall. Perhaps the gods were angry or pleased. To ignore the skies was to ignore the will of heaven itself. Babylonian priests developed detailed omen texts, long lists that connected specific celestial events to earthly consequences. These were called Enuma, Anu, Enlil, a massive collection of astronomical omens stretching across dozens of tablets. For example, if the moon is eclipsed on the 14th day, the king will die. Or, if Venus rises in the west and is bright, there will be peace in the land. These predictions were often used for political decisions. Should the army march? Should a royal wedding be postponed? The sky had to be consulted first. Astral signs could delay coronations, start wars, or bring festivals to a halt. And yet, the Babylonians were not simply superstitious. Their astrology was rooted in observation and pattern. They knew that planets followed cycles, that eclipses returned. They didn't always understand the why, but they understood the when. Their predictions weren't based on guesswork, they were backed by centuries of data. To them, the practical and the spiritual were one and the same. There was no conflict between belief and calculation. A priest could hold both a tablet of star position and a list of divine omens and see no contradiction. In Babylon, astronomy and astrology danced together, one tracking the stars, the other interpreting their meaning. And in that blend of science and spirituality, they found something powerful, a way to bring order to chaos, to find purpose in patterns, and to understand life by reading the sky. Today, we gaze at the night sky through powerful telescopes. We send satellites into orbit and probe the edges of the universe. We name galaxies, measure dark matter, and calculate distances in light years. But behind every modern discovery lies something older, the first spark of wonder lit by civilizations like Babylon. Though their temples have crumbled and their kings forgotten, the Babylonian legacy lives on, etched into clay tablets, buried in stone, and written across the night sky. They were among the first to turn stargazing into something structured, something recorded, something studied. They gave us more than mythology. They gave us methods. Their base 60 number system, developed for trade and timekeeping, still shapes how we measure angles and minutes. Their lunar calendars became the foundation for religious observances across cultures. Their records of eclipses and planetary cycles have helped modern astronomers verify historical dates with stunning precision. But their greatest contribution wasn't a specific theory or equation, it was a mindset. The Babylonians showed that the sky was not unreachable, that it could be observed, understood, and perhaps, just perhaps, predicted. They looked up and asked questions. Not just, what is it, but what does it mean? They gave voice to the stars, and in doing so, they invited generations to listen. Ziggurats no longer pierce the skies of modern cities. The clay tablets sit in museums now, carefully translated and studied. But the spirit of those early stargazers remains. It lives in the astronomer who stays up late tracking a comet, in the child who asks why the moon changes shape, in the scientist who still believes there is more to discover. Every time we chart a constellation or track a planetary orbit, we walk a path they once began, on rooftops, in courtyards, and atop sacred towers. They didn't have telescopes, they didn't have modern math, but they had curiosity, patience, and a deep sense of awe. From the land between two rivers, under the canopy of ancient stars, the Babylonians built a bridge between heaven and earth, and through that bridge we still walk, quietly, humbly, and always looking up.